Everybody, welcome back to class. All right, today we are covering big number 34, Dwight Eisenhower, aka Ike, who was president through most of the 1950s. Okay, he's a two-term president, and he might not be a president that you've heard much about before. Typically, he doesn't rank like super high on the list of like most influential presidents or one of the all-time greats. However, you definitely have to remember that when we think of presidents or like world leaders or something like that, generally a lot of our opinion is shaped by the context of the times in which they were leading, okay, in which they were, a top guy or gal, I guess. Like think about Abraham Lincoln. If the Civil War hadn't happened, if he wouldn't have been the great emancipator that had freed the slaves, if that hadn't happened, would we remember Abraham Lincoln like we do today? Let's say like slavery had just gone away through other like legislative means and had been kind of voted away and the Civil War had not happened. Would you remember Abraham Lincoln as one of the all-time great presidents, or would he go down in history as like Millard Fillmore or James Garfield? And if you're scratching your head like, are those guys presidents? Well, you might be thinking the same about Abraham Lincoln if he had been president during the time that those guys had been. So think about like George Washington, Abe Lincoln, FDR. They were all presidents during very trying, tumultuous, crazy times, okay? Now, Dwight Eisenhower, I think, actually ranks pretty high in terms of just being a solid, consistent president. He was a steady hand at the wheel. However, the 1950s are a time where, yeah, the Cold War is heating up, but no real major wars break out on his watch. And this civil rights movement, there's a lot of civil unrest kind of percolating and tensions are building. But the civil rights movement and a lot of those major changes don't really hit until like later on in the 1960s. So really, he's president during a time where America is still catching its breath from World War II. We're still kind of recovering and the baby boom's going on. The economy's going good. And I think it's a kind of a testament to him that overall, he is a pretty steady hand at the wheel and overall a pretty solid and consistently good president, at least in my view. And of course, that's a subjective thing because any president is going to have people that are fans of him and then detractors that don't like him. But at least the Taluki take is Eisenhower is a pretty solid and good president, and he just happened to be president during a time where, for the most part, things are kind of steady and going good, and the average wages and the economy are going up. And he just kind of dodged the crazy times of the 1940s and then the really crazy times of the 1960s, and was sandwiched in between that in the 1950s, which were kind of just a stable, consistent period in American history. Now, other things that you would know him for. First up, make sure and I would recommend you add some of this stuff into your notes. Now, here's the thing: he's president, and right now we have. We're talking about the Cold War and we're talking about the Civil Rights Movement. Because we're talking about him as a president, he kind of transcends both of those and has some impact on each. So honestly, it wouldn't really matter where you added him in your notes. You could pick either one of those pages. I guess if it was me, I would tie him into the Cold War era notes because I think he had more impact on that frame of things, and I'll explain what I mean by that in just a second. Now, if you've heard his name before, maybe even in this class, where a lot of people knew him, and he definitely was a household name, was very recognizable before he became president, and that's because he was the Supreme Allied commander. He was like the top general for the American and British armies during World War II when we're fighting the Nazis. So he became a household name in America during World War II. People regarded him as like a war hero and that he was a very solid and good general that was reasonable. And he led us to victory over the Nazis. So that's a big plus, a big thumbs up for that past war experience. And America in general, like not all presidents have military experience, but quite a few of our presidents do have some sort of a military background. He definitely falls into that category as a beloved general and war hero from the biggest conflict in human history. So that definitely catapulted him up to the world stage. And then when he decides to run as for president and then eventually for reelection, he wins his elections pretty easily. And it's because he was so familiar. People were comfortable with him and thought, yeah, we can trust that guy. He got us through World War II. So, he's a good dude. He'll be tough on communism and, keep things going, smooth in the country. All right. So that's kind of his background, that military experience. Now, sometimes you might think like a guy that had been a general or had a lifelong career in the military, man, if they get into like the top role as president, that they're going to be like a warmonger and out there starting a lot of conflicts. Well, actually, no major conflicts started on his watch, and he actually becomes president as the Korean War is kind of winding down. So he really kind of brings that conflict to a resolution and ends that war. And he does send, the first kind of small batch of troops or advisors into Vietnam. But the Vietnam War really didn't heat up under his watch either. So he did pretty well there, I think, in terms of foreign policy. So he's president from 1953 to 61. He actually gets elected in 52, but then the president is sworn in the following year in January. A huge plus for him. And part of the reason he gets overwhelmingly elected 2 times is he is seen as tough on communism. Think like we're in the Cold War era and tensions are very high with the Soviet Union. We know the Soviet Unions are developing missiles and they have nukes now. So it was seen as like, oh man, there's potential for a massive war, a World War III to break out. So just that all going on probably made it more probable that we would want to have somebody in the top job with some military experience and that understood the Russians and knew how to deal with like a tough enemy or adversary. That's a huge bonus for Eisenhower because people are concerned about the Soviet Union. People are worried about a potential World War III breaking out. For the most part, neither Americans nor Soviets really wanted that to happen. But most people, if you would have asked them back in this era, if a war was going to happen between the two superpowers, I think most people would have said, yeah, it's a matter of when it's going to happen, not if. So having a guy like him that had defeated the Nazis and Americans felt like we can trust him to stand up to guys like Stalin and the Soviet leaders who we think are bullies and are trying to spread their communist philosophy all over the world. I think the Russians viewed him that way too. They realized that he was a good general, and you probably can't try to pull too much over on this old guy. He's been around the block a few times, and he's not afraid of a fight. So that's a huge bonus for him, and kind of in a weird, like twisting way. By just having that military background, it almost makes it less likely that other countries are going to mess with you because there's that perception that he is a tough, strong military leader. Now, the other thing that's going on, our other big theme of Q4 is the civil rights movement. And we've talked about things like the Emmett Till lynching, murder, and the trial that followed, and Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on the bus. Eisenhower really doesn't want to have a whole lot to do with the civil rights movement. And honestly, most of the criticisms I've ever heard about him as president, typically nobody's critical of him at all in terms of how he dealt with foreign policy in the Cold War. I think he generally gets 2 thumbs up in that department. But I have heard a lot of people be critical of him before in terms of civil rights and that he wasn't doing enough for the Black community. He wasn't really trying to push for equality. I think it's he is from a different generation, and you have to judge people by the context of the times in which they lived and when they grew up and all that. He's from that older era where I think he just took like segregation for granted, and that's just the way things are. I've never seen anything to make me think that Eisenhower was a racist guy himself or that he wanted to like oppress the Black community. But on the flip side of that, I don't think he was a guy that wanted to push civil rights reforms either. He wasn't like a big ally of the Black community. So if that makes sense to you, he's almost, for lack of a better way of saying it, he's almost kind of sort of indifferent towards the civil rights movement. And he looks at that as a sideshow. And I think because of his military background, he views his most important job as being commander in chief and not letting a big World War III break out and trying to keep that balance of power in the world stable. After the Emmett Till lynching and murder, he knew about that. That made headlines. Emmett Till's mother, who you saw in the interview or that documentary I showed, actually wrote Eisenhower a letter after the trial and like basically pleaded with him to have federal investigators reopen the case. Her claim was, and she was right in this, that a fair trial didn't happen down in Mississippi. That jury of all white, all men in the deep South, there was no way they were going to look at it fairly and consider convicting those two white guys that had horribly murdered her son. That's something that I feel like he probably should have pushed more on that. And I think he was disgusted by the Emmett Till lynching and murder, but also I can kind of see it from his perspective that he felt like that's not how it works in America. When there is a local crime like a murder, in the American justice system, that's supposed to be handled by the local authorities. And even if they're kind of corrupt and backwards in Mississippi, that's a state right, and that the federal government doesn't really have any business sticking its nose in there and reopening a case. Now, in my personal opinion, I feel like he probably should have done a little bit more, at least responded to Mamie Till and had been a little bit more vocal there. Now, on the other hand, in terms of like civil rights, the civil rights movement that is starting to gain steam and really take off towards the end of his presidency, he wasn't an outspoken critic of like segregation. It wasn't like he was out there saying, no, we need to integrate America, and he didn't really do anything like that. But what I will give him credit for in terms of civil rights policy was when the Brown versus Board of Education decision happened, and there were several other big court decisions that unfolded, like the one that desegregated or integrated busing. He did make sure that the Supreme Court's ruling was followed down in those southern states. Most notably, when the schools were integrated, there were southern governors that said, to hell with the Supreme Court. We don't care what the Supreme Court says in Washington, D.C. We ain't going to integrate our schools down here in the South. And they were just openly being defiant and saying they were not going to follow those federal policies in the Constitution. So I'll give Eisenhower major credit in that when those Supreme Court rulings came down, he mandated that those Southern governors do follow the law. And actually, numerous times, he sent in the Army Reserve and federal troops to go make sure that, like, hey, if there was a Black student living in the community, the one case that stands out in my mind was in Little Rock, Arkansas. And they were going to integrate that school. And it was not popular with the white community in the neighborhoods where that was happening. He actually sent troops down to make sure that those Black students got into the school safely, were not assaulted, and basically made sure that order was kept and that the Supreme Court ruling was followed and applied down south. So I guess like any president, he has his pros and cons. Was president through a largely stable period in American history. And I think that's a credit to him that overall, I would give him a rating as a pretty good president. But like anybody, he, of course, has some flaws and some shortcomings too. And there were certain things that he probably could have pushed a little harder on or done more with. But that's what I got for you for Dwight Eisenhower, aka Ike, as an American president. And make sure you add that stuff into your notes. If you have any questions about him, hit me up and let me know, and I'm happy to chat with you more about them.